Have you ever noticed how quickly silence gets misinterpreted in cities? When people don't show up to town halls, planners assume apathy. When residents stop complaining, officials assume satisfaction. When neighborhoods quietly adapt to bad design, the system reads it as success. But psychology tells us something very different. Silence rarely means agreement. More often, it means resignation. For decades, urban planning has worked on a flawed assumption that professionals know best and that people will eventually adjust. Streets were designed around efficiency, speed, and economic throughput. Cars became the priority, and human experience became secondary. This is the moment most cities mistake for stability. To fully understand this, you need to look at places where listening was necessary. Medellín, Colombia wasn't always a global example of urban transformation. For many years, it symbolized inequality, violence, and fragmentation. Entire communities lived cut off from opportunity, both physically and socially. The city's geography made this worse. Poorer neighborhoods were pushed into steep hillsides, far from jobs, education, and healthcare. Daily commutes were long, dangerous, and exhausting. Traditional urban planning would have focused on improving the economic core and hoped benefits would trickle outward. But for Medellín, that approach had already failed. Instead of starting with infrastructure, planners started with a question: what does exclusion feel like on a daily basis? Residents talked about time lost, fear during travel, and the feeling of being forgotten. They didn't describe abstract policy problems, they described lived frustration. That's when the city made a crucial decision. It reframed mobility as a human issue, not a technical one. The cable car system was born from this shift. On paper, it was a transportation project. In reality, it was a psychological intervention. By connecting marginalized hillside neighborhoods directly to the city's transit system, Medellín sent a powerful message that everyone belongs there. When people feel acknowledged by systems, they re-engage. Commutes become less draining. Access to jobs and education improves. But beyond that, something deeper happens. People stop seeing the city as an enemy. Meanwhile, Medellín didn't stop at transportation. The city understood that physical access alone wouldn't rebuild trust. People needed spaces that reflected their identities and needs. So instead of placing cultural institutions in wealthy areas, planners built libraries, schools, and parks in the most underserved neighborhoods. These were functional investments, and crucially, residents were involved in shaping how these spaces worked. Community input influenced layout, programming, and usage. This wasn't about aesthetic preference, it was about function. What hours should a library operate? What kind of public spaces would actually be used? What made people feel safe enough to stay? From a different standpoint, this participation matters as much as the final design. When people contribute to decision, they develop a type of ownership. That sense of ownership leads to stewardship. Spaces stopped being anonymous, and they became shared responsibilities. However, equity in Medellín wasn't treated as a talking point. It was embedded in where money and attention went. The city acknowledged a difficult truth. Treating everyone the same doesn't produce equal outcomes. Communities that had been excluded for decades needed more support. By directing high-quality infrastructure to marginalized areas first, Medellín challenged the usual hierarchy of urban investment. This reversed a long-standing message that some neighborhoods mattered more than others. The impact was significant. People who had felt invisible began to feel seen. That sense of visibility reduces alienation. Alienation is one of the strongest predictors of social breakdown. When equity becomes visible, trust grows. As access improved, walkability followed. Streets became safer. Routes became predictable. People began walking not just out of necessity, but choice. Walking does something subtle but powerful in cities. It increases unplanned interaction. You recognize faces and exchange brief conversations. These small interactions build social familiarity. Social familiarity reduces fear. In Medellín, increased walkability wasn't about fitness or lifestyle branding. It was about restoring everyday connection. As people spent more time in public spaces, streets became self-regulating. Safety emerged from presence, not force. This is a pattern urban psychologists have observed repeatedly. When people feel comfortable occupying space, antisocial behavior decreases, not because of surveillance, but because of shared ownership. One of the most striking outcomes in Medellín was the reduction in violence without relying solely on aggressive policing. That didn't happen by accident. When environments are designed to be inclusive and active, they discourage isolation, and isolation breeds fear, which escalates conflict. Medellín's approach addressed safety at its roots: reduce exclusion, increase access, and encourage presence. The city showed that safety isn't just about enforcement, it's about how environments shape behavior, and that lesson travels far beyond Colombia. Now shift to Copenhagen, Denmark. On the surface, this city couldn't seem more different from Medellín. Wealthier, flatter, more predictable. But Copenhagen's success isn't accidental or cultural luck. It's the result of decades of deliberate listening. Copenhagen planners didn't assume they knew how people should move. They observed how people already moved. They studied behavior instead of imposing ideals. When they noticed that people biked more on streets that felt safe, they didn't lecture residents about sustainability, they built more safe bike infrastructure. When people avoided certain crossings, planners didn't blame ignorance, but they redesigned intersections. One of Copenhagen's defining traits is its refusal to fight human nature. Rather than trying to force people into desired behaviors, the city made those behaviors easier. Biking wasn't promoted through guilt, it was promoted through comfort. Wide bike lanes, clear separation from cars, predictable signals, and smooth routes made cycling feel normal and safe. Over time, it became habitual. Eventually, habits form when friction is low. Copenhagen reduced friction everywhere it mattered. Walking benefited from the same logic. Sidewalks were continuous, and crossings made sense. Public spaces invited people to wait instead of rushing through. This didn't just improve mobility, it improved mental well being. When people don't have to constantly assess danger, their stress levels decrease. Moreover, Copenhagen treats community feedback as essential input. When residents raise concerns, planners test responses. Temporary changes are common. A street might be adjusted for a trial period, and a public space might be reconfigured and observed. This approach communicates respect. People see that their feedback leads to visible experimentation that reinforces trust, and trust encourages further engagement, while engagement improves outcomes. Instead of endless debates, the city uses real-world testing. However, equity in Copenhagen isn't loud, but consistent. The city designs streets so children can move independently. Elderly residents can cross safely. People with disabilities aren't treated as exceptions. This universality matters. When environments are accessible to the most vulnerable, they work better for everyone. Independence is a core psychological need. When cities support independence across age and ability, people feel competent rather than dependent. That sense of competence affects how people interact with others. It reduces frustration and resentment. Copenhagen's safety doesn't rely on intimidation or heavy surveillance. It relies on clarity. Clear sightlines reduce uncertainty. Predictable traffic patterns reduce cognitive load. Human-scale streets reduce aggression. When environments are easy to read, people feel calm. Calm environments produce calm behavior. This is design psychology applied at scale. Furthermore, walkability in Copenhagen is about flow, not just sidewalks. Routes feel logically connected. Transitions between spaces feel intuitive. You don't constantly feel like you're negotiating for space with vehicles. That absence of constant vigilance is powerful. It frees mental energy. People feel less exhausted simply moving through the city. Over time, this ease changes how people relate to urban life. Public space becomes something to enjoy, not endure. At this point, it's clear that Medellín and Copenhagen exist in very different contexts, different economies, different challenges, but they reveal the same truth. Cities that listen don't design to impress, they design to support. In Medellín, listening repaired broken trust. In Copenhagen, listening preserved and deepened it. Neither chased perfection. Both focused on responsiveness. Their confidence is quiet. You see it in how people move, how long they stay outside, how safe they feel without consciously thinking about it. This is what cities look like when planners actually listen to people, but this is only half the story. If Medellín shows how listening can repair broken trust, and Copenhagen shows how it can preserve it, Amsterdam shows what happens when listening becomes embedded so deeply that it stops feeling exceptional. Amsterdam doesn't advertise itself as a city that listens. You feel it in how effortlessly the city works around human behavior. For decades, Amsterdam planners made a deliberate choice. People would be the default user of the city, not cars, not corporations, not abstract efficiency metrics. That decision shaped everything that followed. What's important to understand is that Amsterdam didn't become people-centered by accident or culture alone. The city went through its own period of crisis. In the mid-20th century, car traffic was rising, streets were becoming dangerous, and children were dying in road accidents. Instead of treating this as an unavoidable cost of progress, residents pushed back, and the city listened. That moment reshaped Amsterdam's planning philosophy. Safety, walkability, and equity stopped being secondary concerns. They became non-negotiables. Amsterdam's transformation didn't start in planned offices. It started with public frustration. Parents, activists, and local communities demanded safer streets. They didn't ask for perfect solutions. They asked to be heard. And instead of dismissing them as emotional or anti-progress, the city responded with structural change. Streets were redesigned to slow traffic. Entire neighborhoods were reorganized around human movement instead of vehicle flow. Cycling infrastructure wasn't treated as a niche option. It was integrated into the city's core identity. In hindsight, this matters because it sends a clear message. The city exists to protect life, not just move traffic. When people see their safety prioritized in visible ways, their trust in institution increases. That trust changes how they behave in public space. They engage more, they comply more, they care more. In Amsterdam, walkability doesn't feel like a feature, it feels like the default. Sidewalks are continuous, crossings are frequent and intuitive, distances between daily needs are short. You don't need to plan walking, you just do it. This has a profound psychological effect. When movement through the city is easy, people experience less background stress. Stress reduction improves mood, patience, and social tolerance. Walkable environments also change time perception. When trips feel manageable, people don't rush as aggressively. Public space becomes less transactional and more social. Amsterdam benefits from this every day. Equity in Amsterdam is built into how space is distributed. Streets don't signal hierarchy through dominance. Cars don't overpower pedestrians. Cyclists aren't treated as obstacles. Children and elderly residents move independently without fear. This shared access creates something subtle but powerful. It reduces social distance. When different age groups, income levels, and lifestyles occupy the same public spaces comfortably, it normalizes coexistence. People stop seeing others as disruptions and start seeing them as neighbors. This is the result of deliberate design that assumes diversity is the norm. Amsterdam's safety relies on predictable design. Traffic moves slowly where people live. Visibility is high, and intersections are designed to reduce conflict. From a behavioral psychology perspective, this is key. When environments clearly communicate expectations, people follow them without conscious effort. Drivers behave differently on narrow human-scale streets than on wide anonymous roads. Pedestrians feel confident asserting their dominance. Cyclists move fluidly without aggression. The environment does the work before enforcement ever needs to. What truly sets Amsterdam apart is how normal listening has become. Public feedback is part of how the city evolves. Adjustments happen gradually, experiments are tested, and mistakes are corrected. This ongoing responsiveness prevents resentment from building. People don't need to shout to be heard. They trust that concerns will surface in design over time. That trust creates patience, and patience makes urban life smoother. Amsterdam shows us that when listening becomes routine, cities stop feeling defensive. They become adaptable. Barcelona's superblock initiative didn't start as a grand vision. It started as a response to common frustrations, including noise, lack of green space, unsafe streets for children, and poor air quality. Instead of making small adjustments, the city tested a bold idea. What if cars were restricted within clusters of blocks, allowing interior streets to be reclaimed for people? The goal wasn't to ban cars entirely, it was to rebalance priority. Inside superblocks, traffic is limited, streets slow down, space opens up for walking, sitting, playing, and community activity. The result was immediate behavioral change. When cars retreated, people returned. Children played outside, neighbors talked, local businesses benefited from increased foot traffic, noise levels dropped, and air quality improved. This confirms something important. Community doesn't disappear because people don't care. It disappears when environments don't allow it. Barcelona's superblocks made social interaction possible. When people feel safe occupying space, they naturally engage. Safety here was designed. Also, one of the most significant impacts of Barcelona's approach was equity. Lower income neighborhoods often suffer the most from pollution and traffic. By reclaiming streets for people, the city improved quality of life where it was needed most. Access to clean air, quiet spaces, and safe streets is a public health issue, and Barcelona treated it as such. The effect of environmental relief is often underestimated. Reduced noise and pollution lower chronic stress, and lower stress improves emotional regulation. That improves social behavior. It's quite obvious that cities shape mental health. As streets became calmer, walking increased because it felt pleasant again. Walkability multiplied other benefits. Local commerce improved, social interaction increased, and streets became self-policing through presence. This is a pattern across all the cities we have discussed. When walking feels safe and normal, everything else improves with it. Meanwhile, Barcelona's changes weren't universally welcomed at first. Some residents worried, some businesses complained, and this is where listening mattered most. Instead of doubling down defensively, the city adjusted. Feedback led to refinements, communication improved, and data was shared. That responsiveness transformed resistance into participation. Now step back and look at the full picture. Medellín listened to restore dignity. Copenhagen listened to support healthy behavior. Amsterdam listened to normalize human-centered design. And Barcelona listened to reclaim space for life. Different contexts with similar principles. Listening isn't a structural skill in urban planning. When cities listen, they design for how people actually live, not how models predict they should. They reduce friction instead of managing conflict. They embed safety into form, not force. Most importantly, they change how people feel about the city itself. None of these cities are perfect. As a matter of fact, they still face challenges, but they share something rare. They don't feel defensive. They don't feel hostile. They don't feel like they're constantly correcting people. You see it in how people move without fear, and how long they stay outside. and how public space feels shared instead of contested. This is what cities look like when planners actually listen to people. Have you experienced a place where the design made you feel safer, calmer, or more included without you even realizing why? Share your thoughts in the comments, because every city tells a different story, and believed experience matters more than theory. And if this video helped you see how listening shapes better cities, make sure you like and subscribe to the channel.